Shaka Zulu, the warrior king who forged an empire, the darkness before the storm. The sun hung low over the hills of Mtonganeni, casting long shadows across the grasslands of what would one day be known as KwaZulu-Natal. It was July 1787, and in a small settlement, a child entered the world under a cloud of shame that would follow him for years to come. His mother, Nandi, daughter of the Langeni chief, lay exhausted after giving birth. The child's first cries pierced the silence, but they brought no celebration, only whispers, only judgment. His name would be Shaka. The circumstances of his birth violated every sacred custom of the Zulu people. His father, Senzanga, was chief of the Zulu clan, but his mother belonged to the same greater family group. Such unions were forbidden. When Nandi had announced her pregnancy months earlier, the elders dismissed her claims. They said she suffered from an intestinal condition caused by an Ishaka beetle, which caused bloating, nothing more. But when the baby came, undeniable and crying, they could no longer pretend. The child was named after the very beetle they had used to mock his mother. Shame became the first thing Shaka knew. For the first 6 years of his life, Shaka lived at his father's kraal, but he and his mother were never truly welcome. Senzanga had acknowledged paternity and taken Nandi as his third wife, but the marriage was poisoned from the start. The other wives resented her. The children mocked young Shaka. Even the dogs seemed to sense the scorn that followed the boy everywhere he went. Nandi was a strong woman, fierce and unyielding, but even she could not shield her son from every insult, every sideways glance, every cruel word whispered just loud enough for him to hear. The boy learned early that the world was not kind to those born under clouds of disapproval. He learned that words could cut deeper than spears. He learned that survival meant hardening yourself against pain until your heart became stone and your will became iron. Around 1793, when Shaka was 6 years old, the situation became unbearable. Senzanga drove them out. Mother and son were expelled from the Zulu clan, sent away in disgrace to find shelter wherever they could. They returned to Nandi's people, the Langeni, but if they hoped for compassion there, they were bitterly disappointed. The Langeni received them with contempt. Nandi had brought shame upon her family by her relationship with Senzanga, and now she returned, with a bastard child in tow. The other children of the Langeni tormented young Shaka without mercy. They called him names. They excluded him from their games. They reminded him daily that he was unwanted, illegitimate, worth less than the cattle in the fields. Some days, the physical beatings were easier to endure than the relentless psychological warfare of rejection. But Shaka was not like other children. Where others might have broken, he bent. Where others might have withered, grew harder. Every insult became fuel. Every beating became a lesson in endurance. Every moment of loneliness became an opportunity to dream of the day when things would be different, when he would be strong enough that no one could ever hurt him again, when he would make them all regret the way they had treated him and his mother. His only refuge was Nandi herself. She never wavered in her love for her son. She told him stories of great warriors. She reminded him that he carried royal blood, even if others refused to acknowledge it. She taught him that hardship was the forge in which greatness was made, that suffering could either destroy you or make you stronger than iron. In those dark years, Nandi gave her son the most important gift a mother can give. She made him believe that he mattered, that he had a destiny, that the world had not yet seen what he would become. Then, in 1802, came another blow. Famine swept across the region, and the Langeni, desperate to preserve their own resources, drove Nandi and Shaka out once more. Homeless, rejected twice, the boy was 15 years old, standing at the threshold between childhood and manhood, with nothing but his mother's love and a burning desire to prove his worth. They wandered for weeks, seeking shelter, finding only closed doors and turned backs. Death by starvation seemed possible. Death by exposure seemed likely. But then, finally, they found refuge with a small group called the Dletsheni, who were part of the larger and more powerful MFECANE confederation. The MFECANE were ruled by a visionary chief named Dingiswayo, a man who would change Shaka's life forever. For the first time since his birth, Shaka found himself in a place where his past did not define him. Here, among the MFECANE, a young man could prove himself through his actions, rather than suffer for his birth. Here, there was opportunity. Here, there was hope. Shaka grew tall and strong. The years of hardship had not weakened him. They had forged him into something formidable. By the time he reached his early 20s, he stood out among his peers. His body was powerful, his movements quick, his mind sharp. But more than that, there was something in his eyes, a hunger, an intensity that spoke of dreams deferred and vengeance long simmered. When Dingiswayo called up Shaka's age group for military service in 1810, the young man who stepped forward to answer the call was no longer the bullied child of the Langeni. He was someone new, someone dangerous, someone who had been waiting his entire life for exactly this moment. The boy named after a beetle was about to become a warrior, and the world would tremble. The making of a warrior. Dingiswayo was unlike any chief Shaka had ever known. Where other leaders ruled through tradition and inherited authority, Dingiswayo led through vision and innovation. He had traveled widely during his youth, even encountering European traders, and he brought back ideas that were revolutionary for the time. He understood that the old ways of warfare, the ritualized combat where opposing forces threw spears at each other from a distance until one side retreated, were inefficient. He saw that the region was changing, that competition for resources was intensifying, that survival would require new methods. Under Dingiswayo's leadership, the Mthethwa had implemented the Ibutho system, organizing young men into age-based regiments that trained together and fought together. It was a step toward creating a real military force, rather than a loose collection of individual warriors. But the system was still developing, still finding its full potential. When Shaka joined the Izikwe regiment at age 23, he entered a world that felt like coming home. Here, at last, was a place where his strength mattered more than his birth. Here was a place where skill could earn respect. Here was a place where a man could rise based on what he did, rather than who his parents were. And Shaka intended to rise. From his very first days of training, Shaka distinguished himself. He was fearless in combat, throwing himself into every mock battle with an intensity that startled his instructors. He was strong, fast, and possessed an almost supernatural endurance. But more than physical prowess, Shaka demonstrated something rare, tactical intelligence. He didn't just fight, he thought about how to fight better. The traditional weapons of Nguni warfare were the throwing spear and a small shield. Warriors would hurl their spears at the enemy from a distance, retrieve them if possible, and repeat. It was a form of combat that produced relatively few casualties, more about display and intimidation than wholesale slaughter. But Shaka looked at this system and saw only weakness. What happened, he wondered, when your spears were thrown and the enemy was still advancing? What happened when you faced an opponent who closed the distance before you could retrieve your weapons? What happened when warfare ceased to be ritual and became reality? He began to experiment. First, Shaka did something that scandalized his fellow warriors. He stopped wearing sandals. The traditional footwear protected feet from thorns and hot sand, but Shaka argued they were a liability. Sandals slowed you down. They could catch on rocks or roots during a charge. They prevented you from truly feeling the ground beneath you, from adjusting your balance in an instant during combat. He began training barefoot, running for miles every day across rocky terrain, deliberately seeking out the thorniest paths. His feet bled. They cracked and blistered. His fellow soldiers thought he was insane, but gradually, the soles of his feet became as tough as leather. He could run faster and longer than anyone in his regiment. He could change direction in combat without hesitation. And when others limped back to camp with sore feet at the end of a long march, Shaka was ready to train more. Then he turned his attention to weapons. Shaka observed that the traditional throwing spear, the long-shafted assegai, was designed for a specific type of warfare. It was excellent for throwing, but relatively poor in hand-to-hand combat. Once thrown, it left you defenseless until you could retrieve it or draw another weapon. And in the chaos of battle, retrieving thrown weapons was often impossible. Working with his cousin Makadama, who had grown up with him during his exile, Shaka designed a revolutionary new weapon. It was a short-shafted spear with a broad, leaf-shaped blade that measured about 12 inches long. The total length of the weapon was roughly 2 feet, compared to the 6-foot throwing spears commonly used. This new weapon, which would later be called the IKLWA, after the sucking sound it made when withdrawn from flesh, was designed exclusively for close-quarters stabbing. The IKLWA changed everything. With this weapon, a warrior no longer relied on throwing and hoping to hit the target. Instead, he closed with the enemy and engaged in brutal, direct combat. The short handle allowed for quick, powerful thrusts. The broad blade caused devastating wounds, and crucially, the weapon stayed in the warrior's hand throughout the fight, always ready, always dangerous. But the IKLWA was only one part of Shaka's tactical revolution. He also redesigned the shield, making it much larger than the small circular shields traditionally used. Shaka's new shield was made from oxhide stretched over a frame, standing nearly 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide. It was large enough to protect a warrior's entire body from head to knee. More importantly, Shaka developed a technique for using the shield as an offensive weapon. By hooking the left edge of an enemy's shield with your own shield and pulling hard to the left, you could spin your opponent around and expose his unprotected right side. Then, with the IKLWA in your right hand, you could deliver a killing thrust to the exposed ribs or kidney. The move was simple, brutally effective, and could be taught to any warrior with a few hours of practice. Dingiswayo watched Shaka's innovations with growing interest. Here was a young man who thought about warfare the way a craftsman thought about tools, always seeking improvement, always questioning assumptions. The chief gave Shaka opportunities to test his new methods, and the results spoke for themselves. In combat exercises, warriors trained in Shaka's method consistently defeated those using traditional techniques. Shaka's reputation grew. Within 2 years of joining the IKLWA regiment, he had been promoted to command. His warriors were drilled relentlessly, forced to master the new weapons and tactics until they became second nature. Shaka was not a gentle instructor. He demanded perfection and accepted nothing less. Warriors who failed to meet his standards were humiliated in front of their peers. Some were beaten. A few were expelled from the chief regiment entirely. But those who survived Shaka's brutal training became the finest warriors in the region. They could march 50 miles in a day and still fight effectively at the end of it. They could form complex battle formations in minutes. They fought with a ferocity and discipline that terrified their opponents. Yet, Shaka's true genius was not just in weapons or physical training. It was in his understanding of psychology and tactics. He developed what would become known as the bull's horns or buffalo formation, a tactical arrangement that would prove devastating on battlefields throughout southern Africa. The formation divided forces into 4 distinct groups. The chest was the main body of warriors, typically the most experienced veterans. They engaged the enemy head-on, pinning them in place. The horns were 2 flanking groups of younger, faster warriors who would race around the sides of the enemy force, encircling them from behind. The loins were reserves who sat with their backs to the battle so they wouldn't become excited and undisciplined, ready to reinforce any part of the formation that needed support. The beauty of the formation was its flexibility. It could be adjusted based on terrain, enemy numbers, and tactical situation. The chest could hold while the horns encircled, or it could push forward aggressively. The reserves could support a threatened flank or exploit a breakthrough. And because Shaka drilled his warriors constantly in these maneuvers, they could execute complex movements in the chaos of battle with precision that seemed almost impossible. Dingiswayo recognized the brilliance of what Shaka had created. He promoted the young warrior again and again, until Shaka was commanding not just a company, but entire regiments. More than that, Dingiswayo became Shaka's mentor, teaching him not just warfare, but statecraft. He showed Shaka how to build alliances, how to absorb defeated enemies rather than simply destroying them, how to create an empire that lasted. The relationship between Dingiswayo and Shaka was more than that of chief and warrior. It was that of teacher and student, almost father and son. For Shaka, who had never known his own father's approval, Dingiswayo's recognition meant everything. The older man saw in Shaka not just a warrior, but a leader, someone who could change the face of the region. And Dingiswayo's faith was not misplaced. In 1816, news reached the Mthethwa that Senzanga Kona, chief of the Zulu, had died. The Zulu were a small, relatively insignificant clan, numbering perhaps 1,500 people, occupying a few hundred square miles. By law and custom, leadership should have passed to Senzanga Kona's eldest living son. That son was Shaka. But Shaka's half-brother, Sigujana, born to a different mother and without the taint of illegitimacy, had assumed the chieftainship. The Zulu elders had decided that Shaka, the bastard son who had been driven out as a child, had no claim. His blood might be royal, but his birth was shameful. Sigujana would rule. Dingiswayo disagreed. He saw an opportunity to extend Mthethwa influence by placing his protege in control of the Zulu. More than that, he believed Shaka deserved the chance to claim his birthright. So, Dingiswayo gave Shaka a regiment of Mthethwa warriors and his blessing to take what was rightfully his. Shaka marched on the Zulu clan. There was no great battle, no dramatic confrontation. Sigujana was quickly killed, some sources say in a relatively bloodless coup, others suggest assassination. The details are lost to history. What matters is the result. Shaka Senzanga Kona, the boy who had been mocked and rejected, the young man who had been driven into exile, returned to claim the chieftainship of the Zulu. He was 29 years old. He commanded a tiny clan of 1,500 people. But he had the military knowledge of a master tactician, the support of the powerful Mthethwa, and something else, something that burned in his chest with the heat of a forge fire. He had a vision. Shaka looked at the small, weak Zulu clan and saw the raw material for an empire. He saw warriors who could be trained in his methods. He saw land that could be conquered. He saw a future where the name Zulu would be spoken with awe and fear across all of southern Africa. But first, he needed to build an army. And he needed to forge his people into something harder than iron, sharper than the IKLWA, more unstoppable than the warrior he had become. The transformation began immediately. The IKLWA and the revolution. Shaka became chief of the Zulu in 1816, and within days, the small clan began to change in ways that seemed impossible. The new chief was not content with the traditional role of a petty chief, settling disputes and overseeing cattle herds. Shaka had studied warfare under the Mthethwa. He had developed revolutionary tactics, and now he had the authority to implement his vision without restriction. The first thing Shaka did was reorganize the entire military structure of the clan. The old system, where warriors fought when called upon but otherwise lived normal lives, was abolished. In its place, Shaka created something southern Africa had never seen: a true standing army. Every able-bodied male was conscripted into age-based regiments, the Amabutho. These weren't part-time warriors who trained occasionally. These were full-time soldiers who lived in military barracks, the Amakanda, located strategically throughout Zulu territory. The young men were taken from their families at an early age and raised as warriors. They ate together, trained together, fought together. Their loyalty was not to their families or their villages, but to their regiment and to Shaka. This system served multiple purposes. It created a disciplined, professional fighting force. It broke down traditional clan loyalties that might threaten Shaka's authority. And it gave Shaka control over when young men could marry and start families, ensuring that warriors remained focused on military service during their prime fighting years. The training these warriors received was unlike anything previously known in the region. Shaka implemented his own brutal methods, the same ones that had transformed him from a bullied child into a feared warrior. Every morning before dawn, the warriors ran. Not gentle jogging, but punishing marathons across rough terrain. 50 miles was a standard day's march, and warriors were expected to be ready for battle at the end of it. Those who couldn't keep pace were beaten. Those who collapsed were mocked until they found the strength to rise. Those who complained were executed. Shaka had no patience for weakness. He believed that every warrior needed to be driven past the point where ordinary men broke, pushed until they discovered reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. The weapons training was even more intense. Traditional Nguni combat had been somewhat ritualized, with warriors facing each other at a distance and throwing spears while shouting insults. Shaka's method was the complete opposite. His warriors trained in brutal, hand-to-hand combat. They learned to close distance rapidly, to hook an enemy's shield and expose his side, to thrust the IKLWA into vital organs with precision. Shaka made his warriors practice on cattle, learning exactly where to stab for instant death. They trained with practice weapons until their movements became automatic. Thrust, withdraw, thrust again, shield hook left, stab right, move forward, always forward, never retreat, never show fear, never stop until the enemy was destroyed. The psychological aspect of Shaka's training was perhaps even more important than the physical. He needed warriors who would not break under pressure, who would maintain formation, even when facing overwhelming odds, who would obey orders without hesitation, even if those orders meant certain death. To create such warriors, Shaka used both reward and terror. Warriors who performed well received cattle, women, and public praise. Those who failed faced public humiliation and execution. Shaka would sometimes have a warrior killed in front of the assembled army for minor infractions, driving home the message that perfection was the only acceptable standard. The IKLWA became the symbol of this new military system. Every warrior carried the short, stabbing spear and knew how to use it with devastating effect. But the weapon was more than just a tool for killing. It represented a philosophy. Close with the enemy, engage directly, accept no compromises, seek total victory. The traditional throwing spear had allowed warriors to maintain distance, to avoid the true horror of face-to-face combat. The IKLWA demanded intimacy with violence. You had to be close enough to see your enemy's eyes, close enough to feel their breath, close enough to hear their last words. This kind of combat required warriors who were psychologically prepared for the reality of killing. Shaka prepared them. Alongside the IKLWA, Shaka's large oxhide shields transformed defensive warfare. These shields, each distinctively patterned with the colors of the warrior's regiment, were not just protection, they were weapons in their own right. A skilled warrior could use his shield to deflect spears, to bash opponents off balance, to hook enemy shields, and create openings for the killing thrust. Each regiment was assigned shields with specific cowhide patterns, making it easy to identify units even in the chaos of battle. The black shields of one regiment, the brown and white of another, the dappled patterns of a third. This allowed Shaka and his commanders to coordinate complex maneuvers across a battlefield, to know at a glance which units were where and adjust tactics accordingly. But perhaps Shaka's greatest innovation was the bull's horns formation, now refined and perfected beyond Dingiswayo's original concept. The tactic was simple in theory, but required extraordinary discipline to execute. When facing an enemy force, Shaka would deploy his regiments in the characteristic formation. The chest, composed of his most experienced veterans, would advance directly toward the enemy, making contact and engaging them in fierce combat. The chest's job was not to break the enemy, but to pin them in place, to draw their attention forward, to make them commit their forces to the frontal engagement. While the enemy focused on the chest, the horns would spring into action. These were composed of the youngest, fastest warriors, men who could run with incredible speed even after marching all day. The horns would race out to the left and right, swinging wide around the enemy's flanks, then turning inward to attack from behind and the sides. Once the horns made contact, the enemy was surrounded, trapped. With Shaka's warriors attacking from all directions, with nowhere to retreat, the slaughter would begin. The IKLWA was perfectly designed for this type of close-quarters combat. Warriors pressed in from all sides, stabbing, withdrawing the blade, stabbing again. The battlefield became a killing ground. The fourth element, the loins, sat with their backs to the battle several hundred yards away. This served two purposes. First, it prevented young warriors from becoming too excited and breaking discipline to join the fight prematurely. Second, It provided Shaka with a fresh reserve force that could be thrown into battle at the critical moment, exploiting a breakthrough or reinforcing a threatened section of the line. The entire system required not just individual skill, but collective discipline that was almost unheard of in African warfare at the time. Warriors had to trust their commanders completely, had to maintain formation even when fear screamed at them to flee, had to coordinate their movements with hundreds or thousands of other men across a chaotic battlefield. Shaka drilled his regiments constantly in these maneuvers. They practiced the formation on open ground. They practiced it on hills. They practiced advancing through rivers and forests. They practiced at dawn and at dusk, well-fed and hungry, rested and exhausted. Shaka wanted the movements to become so automatic that his warriors could execute them even in the worst conditions imaginable. And it worked. Within months of taking control of the Zulu, Shaka had transformed the small clan's military from a loose collection of warriors into something that resembled a Roman legion. Disciplined, professional, deadly. His warriors could march faster and farther than any army in the region. They could form complex battle formations in minutes. They wielded weapons designed for maximum lethality in close combat. And they had been conditioned to obey orders without question, to fight without fear, to accept death rather than dishonor. The first test of Shaka's military innovations came quickly. The Zulus' small size made them appealing targets, and neighboring clans soon discovered that attacking the Zulu was a fatal mistake. Shaka's warriors, using their superior tactics and weapons, crushed every force sent against them. Clans that had existed for generations were scattered or absorbed into the growing Zulu confederation. Word began to spread across the region. There was a new power rising, a chief named Shaka who commanded warriors unlike any seen before. Warriors who could run like the wind and fight like demons. Warriors who showed no mercy and accepted no surrender. Warriors whose short spears had earned a terrifying nickname. Named after the sound they made pulling free from a body, IKLWA. But Shaka's ambitions extended far beyond simply defending his small territory. He had studied under Dingiswayo. He had learned the art of empire building. He knew that the Zulu could not simply hide within their borders and hope to survive. In the changing landscape of southern Africa, with competing powers consolidating and resources becoming scarcer, there were only two options: expand or be destroyed. Shaka chose expansion. Under his leadership, the Zulu began a systematic campaign of conquest. Nearby clans were given a choice: submit to Zulu authority, contribute warriors to the Zulu army, and accept Shaka as their paramount chief, or be destroyed. Most chose submission. Those who didn't were shown no mercy. But Shaka's method of incorporation was sophisticated. Unlike many conquerors who simply enslaved or expelled defeated peoples, Shaka absorbed them. Young men from conquered clans were integrated into Zulu regiments, mixed with Zulu warriors so they couldn't maintain their old loyalties. They were trained in Shaka's methods, armed with the IKLWA, taught to fight in the bull's horns formation. Within a few years, warriors whose fathers had fought against the Zulu were dying for Shaka with the same fanaticism as native-born Zulus. This system of absorption, rather than destruction, served multiple purposes. It rapidly increased Shaka's military strength, as each conquered clan provided new warriors. It reduced the likelihood of rebellion, since conquered peoples were given a stake in the Zulu success, and it created a military meritocracy where ability mattered more than birth, allowing talented warriors from absorbed clans to rise through the ranks. The Zulu clan, which had numbered only 1,500 people when Shaka took power, began to grow at an astonishing rate. 3,000, 5,000, 10,000. With each conquest, Shaka's army grew stronger. With each victory, his reputation grew more fearsome. But Shaka knew that his growing power would inevitably bring him into conflict with the dominant forces in the region. To the north lay the Ndwandwe Confederation, ruled by a king named Zwide. The Ndwandwe were powerful, numerous, and led by a chief who had proven himself in battle. A showdown between Shaka's upstart Zulu and Zwide's established Ndwandwe was inevitable. The question was not whether they would fight, but when and where, and whether Shaka's revolutionary military system could prevail against a force that outnumbered his warriors more than 2-1. Before that test could come, however, tragedy would strike. The man who had mentored Shaka, who had given him his chance to rise, who had believed in him when no one else did, would fall victim to the very violence that was transforming the region. Dingiswayo's death would change everything. The loss of a mentor. The year 1817 brought tensions that had been simmering for years to a boiling point. The Mthethwa Confederation under Dingiswayo and the Ndwandwe under Zwide were the two dominant powers in the region, and both understood that the land could not support two kingdoms of such ambition. Skirmishes between their forces became more frequent. Cattle raids escalated into full battles. The dance of diplomacy gave way to the language of spears. Dingiswayo still believed in the power of negotiation. He had built the Mthethwa through a combination of military strength and diplomatic skill, absorbing smaller clans through alliances rather than pure conquest when possible. He saw warfare as a tool to be used sparingly, not as the first resort. This philosophy had made him successful, but it would also prove to be his downfall. Zwide was a different type of leader. He believed in power through domination, in establishing authority through fear. He had killed rivals before, had expanded Ndwandwe territory through aggressive warfare, and he saw Dingiswayo's diplomatic approach as weakness. The two men had clashed before, with Dingiswayo usually prevailing through superior tactics and numbers. But Zwide was patient. He waited for his opportunity. That opportunity came when Dingiswayo led a military expedition into Ndwandwe territory. Some sources suggest it was to settle a dispute over a woman who, Zwide claimed, and Dingiswayo, had given to another chief named Malusi. Others claim it was a response to Ndwandwe raids. The exact cause is lost to history. What matters is what happened next. Dingiswayo entered Ndwandwe territory with a force that seemed sufficient for the task, confident in his military abilities and his previous victories over Zwide. But this time, Zwide was ready. He had planned an ambush, and when Dingiswayo's forces engaged what appeared to be a small Ndwandwe contingent, they were suddenly surrounded by a much larger force that had been hidden nearby. The Mthethwa fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and taken by surprise. In the chaos of battle, Dingiswayo became separated from his main force. Whether through treachery or simply the fortune of war, he was captured by Ndwandwe warriors. Zwide had his greatest enemy at his mercy. There was no ransom negotiation, no exchange of prisoners, no mercy. Zwide had Dingiswayo beheaded. Some accounts say the execution was public, meant to humiliate and terrify the Mthethwa. Others suggest it was done quickly and quietly, with Dingiswayo's possessions buried with him. What is certain is that the most powerful chief in the region, Shaka's mentor and protector, was dead. News of Dingiswayo's death reached Shaka like a thunderbolt. The man who had taken him in when he was nothing, who had recognized his potential, who had given him the opportunity to rise, who had supported his claim to the Zulu chieftainship, was gone. Murdered by Zwide. Some sources, particularly the diary of Henry Francis Finn, suggest Shaka might have betrayed Dingiswayo, arriving too late to help in the battle that led to his capture. But most historians dismiss this as slander. Finn and other European traders had their own biases and motivations for portraying Shaka as treacherous. The evidence suggests that Shaka simply received news of the battle too late to intervene, and that he genuinely mourned Dingiswayo's loss. What is undeniable is what Shaka did next. With Dingiswayo dead, the Mthethwa Confederation began to fragment. Various chiefs scrambled for power, and some of the smaller clans that had been held together by Dingiswayo's personal authority started to break away. The entire political structure of the region was suddenly unstable. Zwide, having eliminated his greatest rival, was poised to become the paramount power in the area. But Shaka had other plans. He moved quickly, decisively, and with a political acumen that surprised many who had thought of him as merely a warrior. Shaka reached out to the scattered Mthethwa clans and offered them something they desperately needed: protection. The Ndwandwe, flushed with their victory, were raiding Mthethwa territory. Without Dingiswayo's leadership, the Mthethwa were vulnerable. But if they joined with the Zulu, if they accepted Shaka's authority, they could be strong again. Many of the Mthethwa clans accepted. Almost overnight, Shaka's forces swelled from a few thousand to more than 8,000 warriors. He now commanded the combined military might of the Zulu and much of the Mthethwa Confederation. It was a remarkable political achievement, but it also painted a target on Shaka's back. Zwide recognized that Shaka represented a threat. This upstart chief had absorbed the remnants of the Mthethwa and was consolidating power at an alarming rate. If left unchecked, Shaka might become as powerful as Dingiswayo had been. Zwide decided to crush the Zulu before they could become too strong. In 1818, Zwide sent his son Nomalanjana with a massive army to invade Zulu territory. The Ndwandwe force numbered approximately 12,000 warriors, perhaps more. It was the largest army Zwide had ever assembled, a force intended to destroy the Zulu completely and scatter their clans to the winds. Shaka knew the invasion was coming. His intelligence network, which he had been developing since becoming chief, brought him reports of Ndwandwe movements. He knew he was outnumbered more than 2 to 1. He knew that a conventional battle would likely end in Zulu defeat. So Shaka decided not to fight a conventional battle. Instead, he would use the land itself as a weapon. He would turn the Ndwandwe's superior numbers into a liability. He would demonstrate that the new Zulu way of warfare could defeat even overwhelming odds. The stage was set for a battle that would become legend. A battle that would announce to all of southern Africa that a new power had risen. A battle that would cement Shaka's reputation as a military genius and change the course of history. The Battle of GQOKLI Hill was about to begin. Battle of GQOKLI Hill, the defining moment. April 1818. The dry season had painted the grasslands gold, and the air shimmered with heat that promised to test the endurance of any army foolish enough to march under the noon sun. Nomalanjana, son of Zwide and commander of the Ndwandwe forces, led his massive army south into Zulu territory, with confidence bordering on arrogance. He commanded 12,000 warriors, the largest force ever assembled in the region. Against them stood Shaka with perhaps 5,000 Zulu and allied warriors. The mathematics seemed simple. The outcome appeared inevitable. But Shaka had been preparing for this moment since the day Dingiswayo died. He had studied the terrain, considered every possibility, planned for every contingency. When his scouts brought news that the Ndwandwe were crossing the White Umfolozi River at the northern border of Zulu territory, Shaka set his plan in motion. The first element of his strategy was scorched earth. Shaka ordered his people to evacuate deep into Zulu territory, to the safety of the NANDI forest in the southwest. The civilians, cattle, grain stores, everything of value was moved out of the Ndwandwe's path. Then Shaka's warriors systematically destroyed what couldn't be moved. They burned fields. They poisoned wells. They left nothing that an invading army could use to sustain itself. The Ndwandwe would find no food in Zulu lands, no water, no plunder. They would have to carry everything they needed on their backs or turn around and go home. Next, Shaka selected his battlefield. He found a hill called GQOKLI, a rounded elevation with a flat top, rising about 250 feet above the surrounding plains. It was located about a mile south of the White Umfolozi River, the only significant water source in the area. Shaka placed his main force on top of this hill, with their reserves and supplies hidden in a depression at the summit, where the Ndwandwe couldn't see them. The position gave Shaka multiple advantages. The Ndwandwe would have to attack uphill, exhausting themselves in the assault. The slopes were steep enough that large formations would crowd into each other, neutralizing the Ndwandwe numerical advantage. And with supplies hidden on the hilltop, Shaka's warriors would have food and water, while the Ndwandwe, marching through the devastated landscape, would have neither. But Shaka added one more element to his plan, a masterstroke of deception. He sent about 700 warriors with a small herd of cattle to a position about 10 kilometers south of GQOKLI Hill, where they made themselves obvious. To an observer, It would look like the Zulu were attempting to hide their precious cattle, suggesting that this small force represented half of Shaka's army, and the cattle herd was the main Zulu wealth. Shaka was betting that Nomalanjana would take the bait. When the Ndwandwe army arrived at the White Umfolozi, they found their path to GQOKLI Hill contested by small forces of elite Zulu warriors, positioned at the river fords. The water was still high from recent rains, and only a few spots were crossable. At each ford, Zulu warriors fought a delaying action, making the Ndwandwe fight for every foot of advance. The psychological impact of these small battles was significant. The Ndwandwe warriors, expecting an easy conquest, found themselves locked in brutal combat with enemies who fought with a ferocity they had never encountered. The IKLWA proved its worth in the confined spaces of the riverbanks, where close combat was unavoidable. But Shaka's warriors weren't trying to win these engagements. They were buying time, making sure the Ndwandwe couldn't cross quickly, ensuring the river stayed between the invaders and GQOKLI Hill as long as possible. Eventually, through sheer weight of numbers, the Ndwandwe forced their way across. They regrouped on the southern bank and began their advance toward GQOKLI Hill. As they marched, they saw the results of Shaka's scorched earth policy: burned fields, deserted villages, not a single cow or goat. The land was a wasteland. Some of the Ndwandwe commanders began to feel uneasy. This wasn't how conquests were supposed to work. Where were the people? Where was the plunder? But Nomalanjana urged them forward. The Zulu were clearly desperate, he argued, and desperation made enemies weak. They would crush Shaka's forces on GQOKLI Hill and take everything the Zulu had hidden away. Then the Ndwandwe scouts spotted the decoy force to the south, and Nomalanjana's expression turned triumphant. There they were, he said, half the Zulu army trying to protect their cattle. The fool Shaka had divided his forces. This would be even easier than expected. Nomalanjana made his fatal mistake. He divided his army, sending 4 regiments, about 4,000 warriors, south to capture the cattle and destroy the Zulu force protecting them. This left him with 8,000 warriors to attack GQOKLI Hill, improving his odds, but still giving him a numerical advantage of about 8-4. The remaining Ndwandwe forces approached GQOKLI Hill as the sun climbed higher. Looking up the slopes, they could see Zulu warriors deployed around the summit. The force appeared small, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 men. Nomalanjana is reported to have said it would be like butchering cattle in a kraal. He ordered the attack. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, 8 Ndwandwe regiments formed up at the base of GQOKLI Hill and began their assault. Thousands of warriors surged up the slopes, their war cries echoing across the plains. They expected the Zulu to throw spears down at them, to engage in the traditional style of combat where opposing forces exchanged missiles from a distance. What happened instead shattered their understanding of warfare. The Zulu didn't throw their spears. They held their positions, shields up. IKLWA was ready and waited. As the Ndwandwe warriors climbed higher, the slopes naturally funneled them together. The broad front they had started with compressed into an increasingly narrow space. Warriors found themselves shoulder to shoulder, then pressed so tightly together that throwing spears became difficult. They could barely lift their arms. When the Ndwandwe reached close to the Zulu lines, Shaka gave the order to counterattack. The Zulu charged downhill, not in a disorganized rush, but in disciplined formations, maintaining their shield walls, moving as single organisms. The IKLWA flashed in the morning sun. The Zulu shield-hooked the Ndwandwe, spinning them around, exposing their sides. The stabbing spears thrust forward, withdrew, thrust again. Warriors fell. Blood slicked the hillside. The Ndwandwe, packed together on the slopes, couldn't maneuver, couldn't form proper defensive lines, couldn't effectively use their throwing spears in such close quarters. They had brought weapons designed for one type of warfare and found themselves in another type entirely. The Zulu, by contrast, had trained for exactly this situation. Every warrior knew his role. Every movement had been drilled thousands of times. The first Ndwandwe assault broke. Warriors stumbled back down the hill, some in organized retreats, others in panic. Behind them, they left hundreds of dead and wounded. Nomalanjana realized his mistake. The narrow slopes made his numerical advantage meaningless. He needed different tactics. He reorganized his forces and ordered a second assault, this time trying to spread his warriors more widely to avoid the fatal compression. The second attack fared no better. The Zulu repulsed it with disciplined fury. Then came a third assault, a fourth. Each time the Ndwandwe hurled themselves up the slopes. Each time Shaka's warriors drove them back. The sun climbed higher. The heat became oppressive. The Ndwandwe warriors, who had drunk all their carried water, were becoming desperately thirsty. This was exactly what Shaka had planned. On top of GQOKLI Hill, Shaka's warriors had abundant water and food stored in the hidden depression. They could rotate fresh troops into the line. They could rest between assaults. The Ndwandwe, by contrast, were exhausting themselves, attacking uphill in the heat, with nothing to drink and no food since morning. Some Ndwandwe warriors began to slip away from the battle, making their way back to the White Umfolozi River, 2 kilometers away, to drink and rest. Nomalanjana's force was beginning to leak soldiers even as they fought. Then, in the early afternoon, Shaka saw the signal he had been waiting for. Smoke rising from the south. The decoy force was signaling that the 4,000 Ndwandwe warriors sent to capture the cattle were now returning to rejoin the main army. Shaka had perhaps an hour before the Ndwandwe would be reinforced, and his numerical advantage would be restored. It was time to end this. Shaka ordered his reserves, the warriors who had been sitting with their backs to the battle, to rise and prepare for action. He had held these fresh troops in reserve for exactly this moment. Now, with the Ndwandwe exhausted, thirsty, and demoralized after hours of failed assaults, he would unleash his full strength. The Zulu reserve split into 2 columns and charged down the sides of GQOKLI Hill, executing the horns of the bull formation perfectly. The main Zulu force, the chest, pressed forward aggressively for the first time, driving into the Ndwandwe center. The horns swung wide and then inward, attacking the Ndwandwe flanks and rear. The Ndwandwe, already exhausted and dispirited, found themselves surrounded. Warriors tried to form defensive positions, but the Zulu were everywhere, pressing in from all directions. The IKLWA rose and fell in terrible rhythm. Men screamed, the wounded cried for water, the dead piled upon the dead. The slaughter was terrible. The Ndwandwe formation completely collapsed. Warriors fled in every direction, many throwing away their weapons and shields to run faster. The Zulu pursued, cutting down the fleeing enemy without mercy. The grasslands around GQOKLI Hill became a killing field. By the time the 4,000 Ndwandwe warriors returning from the south saw the disaster, retreated. It was over. The 8,000-strong force that had attacked GQOKLI Hill had been destroyed. Sources vary on the exact casualty figures, but most agree that approximately 7,000 Ndwandwe warriors died that day. The Zulu losses were around 2,000. Heavy, but sustainable. Nomalanjana, Zwide's son and heir, survived the battle but returned to his father with his army shattered. The supposedly invincible Ndwandwe had been crushed by an inferior force using superior tactics. The old way of warfare had met the new, and the new had won, decisively. News of the Battle of GQOKLI Hill spread across the region like wildfire. The impossible had happened. A smaller force had annihilated a larger one through discipline, tactics, and revolutionary weapons. Smaller clans who had been wavering in their loyalties suddenly flocked to Shaka's banner. The Zulu, who had been a minor tribe just 2 years earlier, were now a major power. But Shaka was not satisfied. Zwide still lived. The Ndwandwe were wounded but not destroyed. The war was not over. It had only begun. And Shaka had learned something important from GQOKLI Hill. His new system of warfare, his innovations in weapons and tactics, his brutal training methods, they all worked. They worked spectacularly well. With these tools, he could defeat armies much larger than his own. With these tools, he could conquer an empire. Consolidation and empire. The victory at GQOKLI Hill transformed Shaka's political situation overnight. Clans that had remained neutral suddenly sought alliances with the Zulu. Chiefs who had been considering resistance instead sent envoys with offers of tribute. The entire political landscape of southeastern Africa had shifted, and Shaka stood at the center of the change. But the war with the Ndwandwe was not finished. Zwide had suffered a devastating defeat, but he still controlled significant territory to the north, and he still commanded thousands of warriors. He retreated to rebuild his forces, burning with the desire for revenge. The conflict that had begun with Dingiswayo's death would have to be settled conclusively before Shaka could feel secure. For the next 2 years, the Zulu and Ndwandwe engaged in a grinding war of attrition. There were raids and counter-raids, small battles that cost dozens or hundreds of lives. Shaka used the time to consolidate his gains, to absorb new clans into the Zulu Confederation, to train more warriors in his methods. His army grew larger and more formidable with each passing month. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Mlatuze River, around 1819 or 1820. The exact date is disputed, but the outcome is not. Zwide, having rebuilt his army, launched a second invasion of Zulu territory. This time, he commanded the Ndwandwe forces personally, determined not to repeat his son's mistakes. Shaka used a strategy similar to GQOKLI Hill, but on a larger scale. He evacuated his territory completely, taking all cattle and people far from the invasion route. He laid waste to the land, ensuring the Ndwandwe would find nothing to sustain themselves. Then he waited. The Ndwandwe army marched deep into Zulu territory, growing increasingly desperate as they found no food, no water, no people, no plunder. Shaka harassed them constantly with small raiding parties, striking at night, stealing cattle, killing sentries. The Ndwandwe got no rest, no chance to forage. They were an army marching through a hostile wilderness, slowly starving. When the Ndwandwe were at their weakest, exhausted and hungry and far from home, Shaka attacked with his full force. The battle lasted 2 days. It was brutal, vicious combat with no quarter asked or given. Shaka employed his bull's horns formation to devastating effect, surrounding and annihilating large portions of the Ndwandwe army. Zwide's forces broke completely. The survivors fled north in disarray, and Zwide himself disappeared from history, probably killed during the retreat or shortly after. The Ndwandwe Confederation, which had been the dominant power in the region for a generation, essentially ceased to exist as an organized state. The surviving Ndwandwe clans scattered across southern Africa. Some fled north under leaders like Soshangane, eventually establishing the Gaza Kingdom in Mozambique. Others, under Zwangandaba, migrated as far as the Great Lakes region, traveling over 1,000 miles. Still others, led by Mzilikazi, one of Shaka's own generals who would later rebel, moved west and north, eventually settling in what is now Zimbabwe as the Ndebele people. This scattering of displaced peoples, fleeing the Zulu expansion, triggered what historians call the MFECANE, or the crushing. We will return to this cataclysmic period later. For now, what matters is that with the Ndwandwe destroyed, no power remained that could seriously challenge Zulu dominance in the region. Shaka's empire exploded outward. By 1822, just 6 years after becoming chief of 1,500 people, Shaka ruled an empire covering approximately 80,000 square miles, roughly the size of modern Israel. The Zulu nation's population had swelled to an estimated 250,000 people. Under arms, Shaka could now field between 40,000 and 50,000 warriors, the largest standing army in southern African history. The system Shaka used to incorporate new territories was sophisticated and ruthless. When a clan was defeated in battle, they were given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Submit completely to Zulu authority or be destroyed. Most chose submission. But submission meant more than just acknowledging Shaka as paramount chief. It meant dismantling their traditional political structures and rebuilding them along Zulu lines. Young men from conquered clans were immediately conscripted into Zulu regiments, where they were mixed with warriors from other clans and from the core Zulu tribes. This prevented them from maintaining old loyalties or organizing resistance. These new warriors were trained in Shaka's methods, armed with the IKLWA, taught the bull's horns formation. Within a year or two, warriors whose fathers had fought against the Zulu were dying for Shaka with fanatical loyalty. The army became a melting pot that forged a new identity that transcended old clan boundaries. Shaka established royal homesteads, called Amakanda, throughout his empire. These were not just military bases, but administrative centers where Shaka's appointees governed local affairs. The traditional chiefs of conquered peoples were allowed to maintain some authority, but always under the supervision of Shaka's officials, and always subordinate to the paramount chief's will. Cattle, which were the primary form of wealth in southern African societies, were systematically redistributed. Shaka's warriors received cattle as rewards for bravery and service. Newly incorporated clans received cattle as gifts, binding them to Shaka through obligation. The entire economy of the empire was restructured so that wealth flowed from and through Shaka, making him not just a political authority, but the source of prosperity. The military system continued to evolve. Shaka organized his warriors into regiments based on age, each with its distinctive shield patterns. Young men entered the army as boys, spent decades serving before being allowed to marry, and only retired when they were too old to fight. This created a standing army of men in their physical prime, soldiers who had spent their entire adult lives training and fighting. The discipline Shaka imposed on his army was legendary and terrible. Warriors who broke formation in battle were executed. Those who showed cowardice were clubbed to death in front of their comrades. Even minor infractions could result in punishment. A warrior who lost his IKLWA might be killed. One who returned from battle with his spear unblooded might face questioning and potential execution. But Shaka also rewarded success lavishly. Brave warriors received cattle, which meant wealth and status. They earned the right to marry younger. They received choice positions in the royal homesteads. Shaka created a meritocracy, where ability and courage could elevate a man regardless of his origins. Former slaves, sons of conquered peoples, men of humble birth, all could rise to positions of authority if they proved themselves in battle. This combination of terror and opportunity forged an army of unprecedented effectiveness. Shaka's warriors didn't just fight for their chief. They fought for their own advancement. They didn't just fear defeat. They feared personal shame more than death. The psychological conditioning was profound and produced soldiers willing to charge into situations that seemed suicidal. Shaka himself led from the front when necessary, but more often commanded from positions where he could see the entire battlefield. He developed a sophisticated system of communication using runners and hand signals, allowing him to coordinate complex maneuvers across large distances. His tactical flexibility was remarkable. He could adjust plans mid-battle, reinforcing threatened positions or exploiting unexpected opportunities. The famous bull's horns formation became more refined through experience. Shaka learned to vary it based on terrain and enemy composition. Against a numerically superior enemy, the horns might sweep wide to maximize encirclement. Against a stronger enemy force, the chest might hold defensively, while the horns attacked from ideal positions. Against multiple enemy groups, Shaka might deploy his entire army as horns, with no chest at all, hitting enemies from unexpected directions. But Shaka's genius extended beyond the battlefield. He understood that military might alone could not sustain an empire. He needed to create a new national identity that superseded old clan loyalties. He needed to give people a reason to identify as Zulu rather than Mthethwa or Langeni, or any of the dozens of other groups he had absorbed. Shaka did this through several methods. First, he elevated the Zulu language as the official language of the empire. Warriors from different clans trained together and were forced to communicate in Zulu. Within a generation, the linguistic diversity of the region had given way to linguistic unity. Second, Shaka promoted a mythology of Zulu exceptionalism. The Zulu were not just another clan. They were the chosen people, the greatest warriors in Africa, destined for greatness. This narrative was reinforced through ceremonies, through praise songs that celebrated Zulu achievements, through the very structure of society that elevated those who embraced Zulu identity. Third, Shaka bound the empire together through shared military experience. When warriors from different clans fought together, bled together, celebrated victories together, they formed bonds that transcended their origins. The army became the forge in which a new national identity was created. By 1827, at the height of his power, Shaka ruled over an empire that stretched from the Fongolo River in the north to the Tugela River in the south, and from the Drakensberg Mountains in the west to the Indian Ocean in the east. It was the largest, most powerful, most centralized state in southern African history. But empires built on military might and personal authority are inherently fragile. They depend on the strength and wisdom of the leader. They require constant vigilance and constant success to maintain. And they can fall apart catastrophically when that leader falters. Shaka's empire was about to face its greatest test, not from external enemies, but from the demons within Shaka's own mind. October 1827 approached, and with it came tragedy that would destroy the balance that had made Shaka great. The MFECANE, ripples of destruction. While Shaka's empire consolidated in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, the effects of his military revolution rippled outward across southern and central Africa like shockwaves from an earthquake. This period, roughly from 1815 to 1840, became known as the MFECANE in Nguni languages, meaning the crushing, or Difakane in Sotho, meaning the hammering. It was one of the most devastating and transformative periods in African history. The traditional narrative, established largely by European observers in the 19th century and contested by modern historians, portrayed the MFECANE as a direct result of Shaka's campaigns. According to this view, Shaka's armies directly killed over 1 million people and displaced millions more, depopulating vast regions and creating a wasteland that European settlers found convenient for colonization. Modern scholarship presents a more nuanced picture. The MFECANE was not caused by a single factor or individual. It resulted from a complex interplay of environmental pressures, including drought and population growth, economic competition over trade routes to Delagoa Bay, the ripple effects of European colonial expansion at the Cape, and the military innovations that Shaka and others had developed. Shaka's campaigns were part of this larger pattern, not the sole cause. Nevertheless, the Zulu expansion had profound and undeniable effects. When Shaka destroyed the Ndwandwe Confederation, the survivors didn't simply accept defeat and disperse peacefully. They fled in large, organized groups, and these refugee populations, desperate for resources and security, attacked other communities in their path. The pattern repeated itself across the region. A group displaced by Zulu expansion would attack their neighbors for cattle and land. Those neighbors, unable to defend against the hardened warriors using Zulu-style tactics, would in turn flee and attack other groups. The violence spread like a plague, reaching areas hundreds of miles from Zulu territory that Shaka's warriors had never seen. Some of the most dramatic examples of this diaspora created new kingdoms that lasted for generations. Mzilikazi, who had been one of Shaka's generals before rebelling around 1823, led his followers northwest. His Ndebele people, also called Matabele, carved a bloody path across the Highveld, destroying or absorbing numerous smaller groups. They eventually settled in what is now Zimbabwe, establishing a powerful kingdom that survived until British colonization in the 1890s. Soshangane led Ndwandwe survivors north and east, establishing the Gaza Kingdom in Mozambique. Using military tactics learned from fighting the Zulu, the Gaza dominated the region and even challenged Portuguese colonial authority for decades. The kingdom controlled trade routes to Delagoa Bay and extracted tribute from numerous smaller groups. Perhaps most dramatically, Zwangendaba led his followers on an epic migration that lasted decades. His Ngoni people traveled over 1,500 miles north, fighting their way through or around numerous other peoples. They crossed the Zambezi River around 1835 and continued north through what is now Malawi and Tanzania. Along the way, they absorbed defeated enemies and spread military innovations similar to Shaka's across East Africa. The Ngoni created multiple smaller kingdoms and profoundly influenced the military practices of peoples across the region. The human cost of these migrations and wars was staggering. Traditional estimates placed the death toll at between 1 and 2 million people, though modern historians suggest these numbers may be inflated. What's undeniable is that entire regions were depopulated. Villages were burned, fields were left untended. Survivors fled to mountain strongholds or formed defensive confederations. In some areas, such as the region between the Drakensberg Mountains and the Indian Ocean, archaeological evidence confirms massive depopulation. Sites that had been continuously occupied for generations were abandoned. Human remains showing signs of violent death have been found at multiple locations. The landscape itself bore witness to the violence, with defensive settlements built in inaccessible mountain locations, speaking to the terror of the age. The MFECANE also created new political entities that survived and adapted. The Basuto nation, under Moshoeshoe I, consolidated in the mountain kingdom that became Lesotho. Moshoeshoe skillfully absorbed refugees, built defensive positions in mountain strongholds, and created a new national identity from the chaos. His kingdom survived both the MFECANE and European colonization, and Lesotho remains independent today. The Swazi nation formed under similar pressures, with Sobhuza I leading the Ngwane people to mountain territory and absorbing other refugee groups. The Swazi, like the Basuto, created a defensive confederation that eventually became the modern nation of Swaziland, now Eswatini. Some displaced groups, like the Fengu, fled southwest and sought protection from the Xhosa people in what is now the Eastern Cape. The arrival of these refugees increased pressure on the eastern frontier of the Cape Colony, contributing to conflicts between the Xhosa and European settlers. The MFECANE's effects even reached areas Shaka never intended to influence. Groups fleeing violence in southeastern Africa carried tales of terror and adopted military innovations they had witnessed or experienced. The IKLWA and SHIELD combination appeared in modified forms across the region. The concept of age regiment, military organization spread widely. Even groups that never fought the Zulu directly changed their military practices based on what they heard about Zulu tactics. European observers, arriving in the region during and after the MFECANE, found devastated landscapes and heard stories of warfare and mass death. Many took these observations and constructed narratives that served colonial interests. They portrayed Africa as a place of chaos and barbarism that required European intervention to bring order. They used the MFECANE to justify land seizures, arguing that depopulated regions were empty and available for settlement. This narrative served apartheid-era propaganda in the 20th century, with the claim that Bantu-speaking peoples had only recently arrived in South Africa, depopulating the land in the process, and therefore had no greater claim to the territory than European settlers. Modern historians have thoroughly debunked these arguments, but they illustrate how the MFECANE became entangled in political narratives for generations. The debate among historians about Shaka's direct responsibility for the MFECANE continues. Some argue that his campaigns were limited in scope, and that attributing the entire period to his actions removes agency from other African leaders and ignores other causal factors. Others maintain that while Shaka didn't cause every death or displacement, his military innovations and expansionist policies were the catalyst that triggered the cascade of violence. What seems clear is that Shaka created a new paradigm of warfare in southern Africa. The change from ritualized combat with minimal casualties to total warfare aimed at complete subjugation fundamentally altered how conflicts were fought. Once this new paradigm existed, it spread rapidly. Other leaders, whether fleeing from Shaka or simply observing his success, adopted similar methods. The MFECANE also had long-term cultural and demographic consequences. The migrations mixed different groups, creating new ethnic identities. Languages blended. Cultural practices merged. The political map of southern Africa was completely redrawn, with new kingdoms emerging from the chaos and old ones disappearing. By the time the MFECANE ended around 1840, the entire region had been transformed. Millions of people had died or been displaced. New nations had formed, Military practices had been revolutionized, and the stage had been set for the next great transformation, the arrival of European colonial power in force. But that would come after Shaka's time. In 1827, the Zulu king seemed at the height of his power. His army was the most formidable force in southern Africa. His empire was the largest and most centralized state in the region's history. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a bullied child in the Langeni lands. Then, in October 1827, the one person Shaka loved died, and the great king began his descent into madness. The death of Nandi, daughter of the Langeni, mother of Shaka, the woman who had endured disgrace and exile, who had never wavered in her love for her son, who had lived to see him become the most powerful ruler in southern Africa, fell ill in October 1827. The specific ailment is uncertain. Some sources suggest dysentery, a common killer in pre-modern Africa. Others mention fever. What matters is that she declined rapidly. Shaka, who commanded 50,000 warriors and ruled 250,000 people, who could order the execution of anyone in his empire with a gesture, was powerless to save the one person he genuinely loved. Nandi died on October 10, 1827. What happened next revealed the depth of Shaka's psychological dependence on his mother and exposed the dangerous instability at the heart of the empire. The great military genius, the tactical innovator, the man who had transformed warfare across an entire continent, fell apart. Shaka's grief was not private. It was public, absolute, and it consumed everything around him. He ordered a year of mourning, but his decrees went far beyond traditional practices. No crops were to be planted during the mourning period. This, in a society where missing a single planting season could mean famine. No milk, the staple of the Zulu diet, was to be consumed for an entire year. These orders alone would have caused tremendous hardship, but Shaka went further, much further. He decreed that all pregnant women and their husbands were to be executed. The reasoning, if it can be called that, was that no one should give birth during the mourning period, that no new life should begin when his mother's had ended. Thousands of people faced death sentences for the crime of being pregnant. Cattle that had given birth to calves were slaughtered so that, in Shaka's words, the calves would know what it is to lose a mother. Thousands of cattle, the primary form of wealth in Zulu society, were killed in a fit of grief-driven madness. But the worst was yet to come. Shaka ordered his warriors to fan out across the kingdom and identify anyone not showing sufficient grief. Insufficient grief was defined broadly and arbitrarily. Someone who didn't cry loudly enough. Someone whose expressions seemed insufficiently sad. Someone who was seen eating or laughing within days of Nandi's death. All were marked for execution. The number of people killed during this period of madness is disputed. European sources, particularly Henry Francis Finn, claimed 7,000 people were executed. Some modern historians suggest this number is exaggerated, perhaps by European observers seeking to portray Shaka as a monster to justify colonialism. But even if the number was half that, or a quarter, it represents a horrific slaughter of innocent people whose only crime was surviving. The entire empire was paralyzed by fear. People wept loudly whenever others were present, terrified that someone might report them for insufficient mourning. Mothers smothered their own infants to prove they weren't pregnant. Men denounced their neighbors to demonstrate their loyalty. The social fabric began to tear. Some sources mention that Nandi's burial included placing living handmaidens in her grave to serve her in the afterlife, with thousands of warriors assigned to guard the tomb. While the practice of retainer sacrifice existed in some African societies, the details here are difficult to verify and may represent European sensationalism. What is documented is that the kingdom faced catastrophe. With no crops planted and no milk consumed, famine loomed. The cattle herds, already depleted by the ritual slaughters, couldn't support the population. People began to starve. Whispers of rebellion spread. The person who finally broke the cycle was a man named Gala, about whom little is known beyond this single act of courage. During one of Shaka's public appearances, Gala stood up and spoke plainly, saying that Nandi was not the first person to die in Zululand, that death was a natural part of life, and that the kingdom could not survive if this madness continued. It was the kind of blunt talk that normally resulted in immediate execution. Shaka's courtiers braced themselves for the order. But something in Ngala's words reached through Shaka's grief and touched the part of him that was still rational. The king paused. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, he thanked Ngala for his honesty and awarded him cattle as a gift. Shaka lifted the most extreme of his mourning edicts. Crops could be planted again. Milk could be consumed. The pregnant women and their husbands were spared. The daily executions stopped. The kingdom took a collective breath of relief. But the damage was done. Shaka had revealed himself to be unstable, capable of ordering mass death on a whim, willing to destroy his own people in service to his emotional needs. More importantly, he had shown that he could be challenged, that his authority was not as absolute as it had seemed, that even the great king could be wrong. Doubts, once planted, are difficult to uproot. Shaka seemed to recognize that he had gone too far, but instead of moderating his behavior, he threw himself into military activity with manic energy. He sent his armies on distant campaigns, pushing them harder than ever before. The warriors, who had expected a rest period after the crisis, found themselves marched to exhaustion and then marched further. In early 1828, Shaka sent his main army south on a raid that carried them to the borders of the Cape Colony. It was the longest campaign the Zulu had ever undertaken, covering hundreds of miles. The warriors marched through unfamiliar territory, fought numerous small battles, and finally returned home after months, exhausted but expecting the traditional rest period, where they could marry, tend their cattle, and recover. Instead, Shaka immediately ordered them to prepare for another campaign, this time far to the north. There would be no rest, no marriages, no recovery time, just more war. It was too much. The warriors grumbled. The commanders expressed concern. Even Shaka's closest advisors suggested that the men needed rest. But Shaka would not listen. He was driven by demons only he could see, perhaps seeking to outrun his grief through constant activity, perhaps trying to reassert his dominance after the mourning crisis had shown his vulnerability. His half-brothers, Dingane and Mushlangana, watched all this with growing interest. They were sons of Senzanga Kona by other wives, and they had lived in Shaka's shadow their entire adult lives. They had never challenged him because Shaka was strong, successful, and surrounded by loyal warriors. But now, with the army exhausted and sent north, with the king showing signs of instability, with discontent spreading through the empire, they saw an opportunity. They were not alone in their thinking. Mbopa, one of Shaka's bodyguards and advisors, also recognized that the king was becoming a liability. Whether motivated by personal ambition, genuine concern for the kingdom, or simply survival instinct, Mbopa joined the conspiracy. The plan was simple. With the main army far to the north, Shaka's personal security at the royal kraal was minimal. He trusted his immediate household guards completely, believing that no one would dare strike at him directly. That trust would be his downfall. The exact details of what happened next vary by source. Some say Dingane and Mushlangana made several attempts to kill Shaka before they succeeded. Others claim it happened on the first try. What's generally agreed is that the assassination took place in September 1828, almost exactly a year after Nandi's death. The method was betrayal of the most intimate kind. Shaka was meeting with a delegation in his cattle enclosure, discussing matters of state. It was the kind of routine activity that happened almost daily. Mbopa, who was present as part of Shaka's household, began shouting at the delegation, accusing them of being late and showing disrespect. He drove them out of the enclosure, creating confusion and distraction. In that moment of chaos, Mushlangana approached from behind. He carried an IKLWA, the weapon Shaka himself had perfected, and with that weapon, Mushlangana stabbed his half-brother in the back. Shaka staggered but didn't fall immediately. He was a warrior who had survived numerous battles, and his body didn't yield easily to death. But then Dingane joined his brother, stabbing Shaka again and again, until the great king fell. Some accounts claim Shaka managed to speak before he died. His alleged last words have become famous, though their authenticity is debated. "You will think you are kings, but you will be devoured by the white men." Or, in another version, "You are stabbing me, kings of earth. "You shall meet your death by killing one another." Whether Shaka actually spoke those words, or whether they were invented later to create a sense of prophecy, they proved eerily accurate. The Zulu would face European colonial power within decades, and Dingane would eventually be overthrown and killed, just as he had killed Shaka. The assassins dumped Shaka's body into an empty grain pit and filled it with stones and earth. There was no funeral, no period of mourning, no elaborate tomb. The exact location of Shaka's grave is unknown to this day. The man, who had created the largest empire in Southern African history, was buried in an unmarked pit, like a common criminal. Dingane immediately assumed power. His first acts were calculated to win support. He released warriors from their regiments and allowed them to marry. He lifted restrictions that Shaka had imposed. He presented himself as a more reasonable, less demanding ruler. The exhausted warriors and ordinary Zulu people, relieved to be free from Shaka's manic demands, accepted Dingane's rule with little resistance. Mushlangana, who had struck the first blow, didn't enjoy power for long. Dingane had him killed shortly after the assassination, eliminating a potential rival and the only witness to the murder who wasn't completely under Dingane's control. Thus ended the life of Shaka Zulu at approximately 41 years old. He had ruled the Zulu for just 12 years, from 1816 to 1828. But in that brief time, he had transformed a tiny clan of 1,500 people into an empire of 250,000. He had revolutionized warfare across an entire continent. He had created a military machine that would be studied by historians and military theorists for generations. He had also revealed the terrible cost of power built on violence and personal authority. His death came not from external enemies, but from the people closest to him, men who had decided that the king had become more dangerous than any foreign threat. The question remained: what would become of the empire Shaka had built? Could it survive the loss of its founder? Would the innovations and systems Shaka created outlast the man himself? The answer would unfold over the next several decades, in battles with European colonizers, who had indeed begun to arrive, just as Shaka's dying words reportedly predicted. But before we reach that epilogue, we must ask, what was Shaka's true legacy? Who was this man who had changed the course of history? And what lessons does his story hold for us today? Legacy, the lion that changed Africa. In the years following Shaka's assassination, the Zulu nation continued under changed leadership. Dingane ruled for a decade, facing challenges Shaka never had to confront. In 1838, Dingane made a catastrophic decision that would haunt the Zulu for generations. He had a delegation of Voortrekkers, Boers migrating inland to escape British control at the Cape, murdered at his royal capital after they had returned cattle and seemed to be negotiating in good faith. The Voortrekker leader, Piet Retief, and his men were killed in an act that galvanized the Boer community against the Zulu. Later that year, at the Battle of Blood River, a small force of Boers with firearms defeated 3,000 Zulu warriors, killing up to 3,000 while suffering only minor wounds. The battle demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of firearms and organized wagon defenses against even the most disciplined traditional warriors. The age of Zulu military dominance had encountered its technological limit. Dingane's reign ended badly. He was overthrown by his half-brother Mpande, who ruled for 3 decades with British and Boer support, becoming a vassal to external powers in exchange for maintaining nominal independence. The Zulu kingdom survived, but was greatly diminished. The final test came in 1879 with the Anglo-Zulu War. The British Empire, at the height of its power, invaded Zululand with a modern army equipped with rifles, artillery, and advanced tactics. The reigning king was Cetshwayo, grandson of Shaka's half-brother Mpande. On January 22, 1879, at the Battle of Isandlwana, a Zulu force of approximately 20,000 warriors encountered a British column. Using tactics refined by Shaka, including the bull's horns formation and aggressive close combat, the Zulu achieved one of the most stunning military victories in colonial history. They destroyed the British force, killing over 1,300 soldiers, including hundreds of regular British troops. The IKLWA and the tactics Shaka had developed 50 years earlier proved that African forces, properly led and motivated, could defeat European armies. But the victory was short-lived. The British returned with larger forces, better preparation, and devastating firepower. At the Battle of Ulundi in July 1879, British forces decisively defeated the Zulu army, and the kingdom was subsequently annexed and broken up. Yet even in defeat, the Zulu had demonstrated something profound, that the systems Shaka created were not dependent on his personal leadership. 50 years after his death, warriors trained in his methods nearly destroyed a British army. The military innovations survived their creator. Today, historians debate Shaka's legacy from multiple perspectives. For Zulu ethnic nationalists and many Pan-Africanists, Shaka represents African achievement, military genius, and resistance to foreign domination. He demonstrated that African leaders could build empires, innovate tactically, and create military forces that rivaled anything Europe could field. The fact that a man who began life as a rejected bastard created the largest state in Southern African history is a powerful narrative of achievement against odds. For others, including many black South Africans who are not Zulu, Shaka represents tyranny, violence, and the destructive capacity of authoritarian leadership. His campaigns caused immense suffering. His paranoid brutality in his later years led to the deaths of thousands of his own people. His legacy includes not just military achievement, but also the pain of the MFECANE and the destruction of numerous other African societies. These perspectives are not mutually exclusive. Shaka can be both a military genius and a tyrant. He can represent both African achievement and the dangers of unchecked power. History's greatest figures are rarely simple heroes or villains. They are complex human beings, whose actions had profound consequences, both positive and negative. From a purely military perspective, Shaka's achievements are undeniable. He took the Ibutho system pioneered by Dingiswayo and perfected it into a true standing army. He developed weapons specifically designed for the type of warfare he intended to wage. He created tactics that maximized the effectiveness of his forces while minimizing enemy advantages. He understood logistics, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and the importance of discipline. Military historians have compared Shaka to figures like Alexander the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Genghis Khan. The comparison is not idle. In 12 years, Shaka transformed a tiny clan into an empire covering 80,000 square miles. He commanded armies of 50,000 men with precision and tactical sophistication. He changed how warfare was conducted across an entire region. Few military leaders in any era have achieved such comprehensive transformation in such a short time. The IKLWA itself became a symbol of Zulu culture and has remained so into the modern era. The weapon appears in the imagery of Zulu nationalism, in museums showcasing African history, in popular culture references to Zulu warriors. Original IKLWAs from the colonial period are sought-after artifacts, with provenanced examples from battles like Isandlwana selling for thousands of pounds at auction. The bull's horns formation has been studied in military academies around the world as an example of effective tactical innovation. The principle of pinning an enemy in the center while enveloping from the flanks is ancient, dating back to Hannibal's victory at Cannae in 216 BC. But Shaka's refinement of the concept, adapted to southern African terrain and conditions, demonstrated that brilliant tactics transcend cultural and technological boundaries. Shaka's systems of military organization, including age-based regiments and centralized command structures, influenced military developments far beyond Zulu territory. Groups that had fought against or alongside the Zulu adopted modified versions of his systems. The military innovations spread across southern and eastern Africa, appearing in forms ranging from direct copies to local adaptations. But perhaps Shaka's most enduring legacy is less tangible: the Zulu national identity itself. Before Shaka, the Zulu were one minor clan among many. After Shaka, they were a nation with a distinct identity, proud military tradition, and sense of historical destiny. This identity survived colonialism, apartheid, and the challenges of the modern era. Today, the Zulu are the largest ethnic group in South Africa, numbering over 12 million people, and they maintain strong cultural traditions connected to their historical origins. The Zulu king remains an important figure in South African politics and culture, even though the monarchy holds no formal governmental power. The current king, Zulu Kazwelithini, is recognized as the traditional leader of the Zulu nation and represents continuity with a history that stretches back to Shaka. Yet we must also reckon with the darker aspects of Shaka's legacy. His military campaigns caused immense suffering. The MFECANE, whether primarily caused by Shaka or by broader forces with Shaka as a contributing factor, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Entire societies were destroyed. Cultures that had existed for generations vanished. Shaka's brutality toward his own people, particularly in his later years, demonstrated the dangers of absolute power. The executions of warriors for minor failures, the casual violence toward anyone who displeased him, the mass killings after his mother's death, all reveal a man capable of monstrous cruelty. The system he created encouraged this brutality, making violence not an occasional necessity, but a constant tool of governance. The question of how much credit or blame Shaka deserves for specific outcomes will likely never be fully resolved. Historical sources are limited and often biased. European observers like Finn and Isaacs had their own agendas and may have exaggerated Shaka's brutality to justify colonialism. But African oral traditions also contain many stories of Shaka's violence and tyranny, suggesting that the brutality was real, not merely European propaganda. What seems clear is that Shaka was a product of his circumstances, who then shaped those circumstances in turn. The bullied child developed into a man hungry for power and validation. The military genius created systems of warfare that changed a continent. The nation builder forged a new identity from disparate clans. The tyrant destroyed as much as he created. All these things can be true simultaneously. Modern South Africa has a complex relationship with Shaka's legacy. During apartheid, the government simultaneously romanticized Zulu warrior culture, while using it to divide black South Africans along ethnic lines, promoting Zulu nationalism as a counterweight to broader black unity. After apartheid ended, some South Africans embraced Shaka as a symbol of resistance to colonialism, while others rejected the militaristic, male-dominated aspects of his legacy as inconsistent with modern democratic values. The story of Shaka Zulu teaches us several lessons that remain relevant today. First, that individuals can change history through vision, determination, and the courage to innovate. Shaka looked at traditional warfare and saw only limitations. He asked, "What if?" and then made his vision real. That kind of transformative thinking appears throughout history's great figures. Second, that power without accountability leads to abuse. Shaka's later years demonstrated what happens when a leader faces no effective checks on his authority. The man who had been a brilliant tactician and nation builder became a paranoid tyrant, because no one could tell him no. Absolute power corrupted absolutely, as it has throughout human history. Third, that military achievement and moral character are separate things. Shaka was undeniably a military genius. He was also capable of ordering mass executions on a whim. We can study and learn from his tactical innovations while condemning his brutality. One does not cancel the other. Fourth, that the consequences of our actions ripple far beyond what we intend. Shaka wanted to build an empire. He did so, but in the process, he triggered migrations and conflicts that affected regions he never saw and peoples he never encountered. The MFECANE reshaped Southern African demographics in ways that still matter today. Our choices have consequences we cannot fully predict or control. Finally, that human beings are complex. Shaka was not simply a hero or a villain. He was a man shaped by trauma who rose to power through brilliance and determination, who built something unprecedented, who protected his people while brutally oppressing others, who loved his mother deeply and slaughtered thousands in his grief at her death. He contained multitudes, as do we all. The story of Shaka Zulu, the illegitimate child who became a king, the bullied boy who forged an empire, the military genius who changed the nature of warfare across a continent, remains relevant because it speaks to fundamental human experiences: the desire to prove ourselves, the hunger for recognition, the capacity for both creation and destruction that exists in every human heart. In 12 years, from 1816 to 1828, Shaka transformed 1,500 people into 250,000. He turned a few hundred square miles into 80,000. He created from nothing the most powerful military force in Southern African history. And when he died, betrayed by his own kin, he left behind a legacy so powerful that we are still arguing about it nearly 2 centuries later. That is the mark of a truly transformative figure. Whether we view him as hero or villain, liberator or oppressor, genius or madman, we cannot ignore him. Shaka Zulu changed Africa forever. His methods, his innovations, his nation, all survived him. The IKLWA still represents Zulu culture. The military tactics are still studied. The empire, though long destroyed by colonial powers, lives on in the Zulu people's memory and identity. The boy named after a beetle, rejected and bullied, became a lion whose roar echoed across continents, and that roar has never fully faded into silence. The echo of the warrior. Stand on the hills near GQOKLI today, and you can almost hear them, the war cries of warriors who fought almost 2 centuries ago, the clash of shields, the whispered prayers before battle. The grass grows tall now where blood once soaked the earth. The land is peaceful, marked only by an information board explaining what happened here. But the ghosts remain. Shaka's story is ultimately a human story. It is about a boy who was wounded deeply and who transformed that wound into a weapon. It is about a man who took the pain of rejection and forged it into an empire. It is about the terrible price of greatness and the cost of power built on violence. We see in Shaka something that exists in all of us: the capacity to overcome. He was not born with advantages. He was not privileged. He was bullied, rejected, cast out, told he was worth less than others. And he decided that the world was wrong about him. That decision, that refusal to accept the judgment of others, drove him to achieve things that seemed impossible. A tiny clan became an empire. Warriors who barely knew organized warfare became the most formidable fighting force in southern Africa. A rejected bastard became a king whose name is still spoken with awe. But we also see in Shaka the danger of letting old wounds fester. The bullied child never truly healed. He carried his pain and rage through his entire life. And in his later years, when his mother died, that unhealed trauma erupted in ways that nearly destroyed everything he had built. Greatness and tragedy walked hand in hand through his story. The IKLWA, the weapon that made Shaka's military revolution possible, is now a museum piece. But the principle it represented, of adapting to circumstances rather than clinging to tradition, of innovating rather than accepting limitations, remains as relevant today as it was in 1818. Shaka looked at the world he lived in and asked how it could be different. Then he made it so. The bull's horns formation, which gave Shaka victory after victory, teaches us that old problems sometimes require new solutions. Traditional Nguni warfare was ritualized and limited in its destructiveness. Shaka reimagined what warfare could be, creating tactics that shocked his enemies and changed the game. He wasn't the first to use envelopment, but he perfected it for his context. That kind of adaptive thinking appears in every field of human endeavor where progress occurs. The Zulu nation, which Shaka built from fragments, reminds us that identity can be created, that people can be unified around shared purpose, even when they come from different backgrounds. Shaka took warriors from dozens of different clans and made them Zulu. He gave them a common language, common methods, common pride. That nation survived his death, survived colonialism, survived apartheid, and thrives today. But the mass graves of the MFECANE warn us that innovation without ethics leads to catastrophe. The thousands executed during Shaka's mourning for his mother remind us that power without accountability becomes tyranny. The betrayal that killed him demonstrates that leadership based on fear ultimately fails. Shaka's legacy is not simple. It cannot be reduced to hero or villain, to liberator or oppressor. He was human, with all the complexity that entails. He achieved greatness through determination and brilliance. He caused immense suffering through brutality and paranoia. Both things are true. Both things matter. The boy who started life as a joke, named after a beetle, became a warrior king who changed the face of Africa. His 12-year reign reshaped Southern Africa's political landscape. His military innovations influenced tactics across the continent. His name became legend. And the final irony is that Shaka's greatest achievement might be simply that he proved what was possible. He showed that African leaders could build empires to rival those of any continent. He demonstrated that African military forces, properly organized and led, could defeat seemingly superior enemies. He proved that innovation and discipline could overcome numerical disadvantages and technological limitations. 50 years after Shaka's death, at Isandlwana, warriors using his tactics destroyed a British column. The methods survived the man. The legacy outlasted the individual. The echo of the warrior still resonates. We tell Shaka's story not because he was perfect. He wasn't. We tell it because he was transformative, because he took the scraps he was given and built something that mattered, because he refused to accept the limitations others placed on him, because he changed the world. His story reminds us that greatness and tragedy often occupy the same space, that the capacity for creation and destruction exists in the same heart, that the wounded child and the mighty king were the same person, separated only by time and circumstance. The grass grows on GQOKLI Hill. The white Umfolozi River flows as it always has. The land has moved on, as land always does. But memory persists. Stories endure. And the legend of Shaka Zulu, the king who transformed the Zulu into Africa's most powerful army, the warrior who revolutionized an entire continent's approach to warfare, remains as vital today as it was nearly 200 years ago. Because the real power of Shaka's story is not in the details of battles won or enemies defeated. It is in the lesson that a single life, lived with purpose and determination, can change the world. That innovation matters, that courage counts, that where you start does not determine where you finish. The boy rejected by his father became the king who built an empire. The child bullied by his peers became the warrior feared by nations. The illegitimate son became the man whose name is still spoken with awe, centuries after his death. That is the legacy of Shaka Zulu. That is why we remember. That is why the story still matters. If this story moved you, if the tale of the warrior king who rose from nothing touched something in your spirit, then honor it. These are not just words on a screen. They are the echo of real people who lived, fought, suffered, and achieved greatness. They are reminders that human beings are capable of remarkable things when driven by vision and determination. Like this story, share it, subscribe to this channel, because legends like Shaka's deserve to be told and retold, because every generation needs to hear about people who refused to accept limitations, who dared to imagine something better, who changed the world through sheer force of will. The next legendary story is waiting to be told. The next echo of ancient warriors is ready to resound. And you can be part of keeping these memories alive. Because when we remember the past, when we honor those who came before, we keep their spirits alive. We give meaning to their struggles. We ensure that their lessons are not lost. Shaka Zulu was many things: warrior, king, innovator, tyrant, visionary, destroyer, creator, human. His story contains multitudes because he contained multitudes. And by remembering him, by wrestling with his legacy, by learning from both his triumphs and his failures, we honor not just one man, but all of humanity's capacity for transformation. The IKLWA has been silent for generations. The bull's horns formation exists now only in history books and museums. The Zulu empire Shaka built was destroyed by colonial powers long ago. But the echo of the warrior king still resonates. And as long as people tell this story, as long as we remember the boy who became a legend, Shaka Zulu Kona will never truly die. His roar still echoes across the centuries. And if you listen carefully, in the wind across the hills where warriors once stood ready for battle, you can hear it still. The lion lives, the legend endures, and the story continues.